Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with another look at MuseScore 4 and creating playback files inside of MuseScore 4. So these are files that are used to play back your compositions as accurately and realistically as possible. The MuseScore 4, MuseScore Studio version 4 and on application has a very good play engine and a very good set of samples, a sample library that's native to the program. In addition to that, if you're on Windows or Mac, which I am not, I'm on Linux, but if you're on Windows or Mac, you have access to some other sound libraries as well that have been ported to MuseScore 4 and are designed to work with the play engine as well. What I want to look at here today is when you're making playback files using unorthodox layers, doubling layers to get the sound that you want. First, though, let's listen to this composition. This is called A Treasure Hidden. So we'll listen to it and then I'll discuss some of the things that are going on in here. Okay, so that's the playback file without any effects applied to it, no mastering. It's just the ordinary playback. And what I would do from here is I probably would do some very mild compression and some EQing to give a good master to this and normalization. But the goal, I think, when going into that is to have something that is already as close to perfect as you can achieve. And part of that is getting the kind of sound quality out of the instruments that you desire. And there's an issue with this where some of the sample sets, particularly with Muse sounds, they're very, very good, but they're also somewhat vanilla. You may want a really edgy, brassy sound, and without having access to another library that will play through the play engine inside of MuseScore 4, there's some things you can do for that. You might want to have a very prominent bass line, and the sounds just aren't cutting it in the mixer. There's some things you can do for that. And this is where layering comes into play. Now, the one thing I want to make you aware of, if you're not aware, if you've not worked in a digital audio workstation with MIDI mockup, you may not be aware, or even if you do, you may not be aware, that a very common trick in mockup is to use layered sounds in unorthodox ways, particularly synthesizers. In addition to that, you can mix and match libraries that have different characteristics that achieve what you're looking for at very specific moments. And there's no reason why you can't do the same thing inside of MuseScore 4 inside of the playback document itself. So what I want to do here is just point out a few things. When you look at the brass section, we get to this very, very big, loud section here. And again, I would probably EQ this a little bit so that it's a little brighter anyway. But to get that brassy, edgy sound that we're not quite achieving at full dynamics from the Muse sounds, what you can do is double up with other sounds that will give you the quality that you're looking for. So what I did here is I have the trumpets here are playing up here in this high register at forte, and then underneath that I have a muted trumpet. So this is using the Muse Sounds mutes, and it gives you a very different quality. So muted trumpet, and I am a trumpet player, so I'm speaking from personal experience on this. Putting a mute into a trumpet, what it does is it decreases a number of frequencies and then leaves some others remaining. And many of the frequencies that are remaining are very high frequencies. It gives kind of a buzzy, edgy sound. So what you can do is have an inconsistent kind of playback. So this is just some notes, some of the notes, arrival pitches, and you really have to understand music to do this. It's not a simple matter of copying and pasting everything. But I have some accentuated notes that I want to sound really edgy, and I have it playing at fortissimo on this muted trumpet sample. It's a real muted trumpet, real samples. It's not, synthesized. We'll talk about synthesizers in a minute here. And that gives me a different kind of quality. So if I listen to we'll go back to the score here. If I listen to just the trumpets as they are, you get kind of a very nice, clean Baroque sound, right? But we want something that's a little bit more Americana, a little bit more edgy. So what we do is we incorporate these mute sounds to give us that. And listen to this again. And now suddenly it's very bright. You hear that kind of that subtle buzzing. Now, it may be noticeable here as we're just listening to the trumpets, but when you bury it into the mix with everything else, it really helps it to stand out, just that little bit of extra edge. Now, it's very important when you do this that you're mixing your additional layers into the exact same pan spot as the instrument that you are supporting. So the trumpet, both trumpet parts in the same place. And on the muted trumpet, I have the reverb down a little bit because I don't really want to have those sounds hanging out over the end of it. Another thing that I did here is, because I'm giving it edge, is I shortened up the note value. So everywhere that I'm doubling, the notes are much, much shorter, and I'm really focusing on the attack of the notes. I'm leaving the body up to the original instrumentation that is there. Now, this may seem very outside the box and very hacky, but this is precisely the kind of thing that a good mock-up composer would do inside of a digital audio workstation. We're just applying those sensibilities to the playback file. This is not really something really crazy and unusual. This is something that mock-up composers do all the time, just in a different environment. Another one down here is I did the same thing with the trombone. So on the trombones, and in this case, I really did just copy and paste whole sections, and I shortened up notes where it seemed appropriate, particularly on longer notes, so that I would get that same kind of buzzy muted sound on the trombones. And then down here on the bass trombone, this is a little bit different. Now, before I look at the bass trombone, I want to look down here, way down at the bottom at the string section. And this is something I've been doing in mock-ups inside of MuseScore since the very beginning of the MuseScore 4 release. I add my sub bass directly into the playback file. So rather than creating this in Digital Audio Workstation, the sub bass is actually in there. Now, the sub bass is a synthesized sound, usually a sine wave or something close to it. I use the warm synthesizer pad from the classic MS Classic Sounds. And I have it playing an octave below the contrabasses, and I have it mixed very, very low in the mix. So it's very, very subtle kind of rumble underneath it. And here's the contrabass note. But underneath that, you can barely hear it. It's so low. And this does, this is very active in the mix. You'll hear that. You'll feel this more than hear it. What I do is I mix this in so that I push the mixer up until you can hear it, and then I pull it back until it just barely disappears, and it actually is still there. But this is a very old trick. Now, I want to take you back up here to the brass section, and we're going to apply something very, very similar. And with this, I played around with some of the different sounds. I wanted more edge on my bass trombone. I have my bass trombone doubling my tuba on these really big hits. And that's a composer trick to make the tuba really loud and full. You just stick a bass trombone on there to double it out. But I still wasn't getting kind of that raspy rumble that I really wanted, that gravelly sort of sound on these major, major hits. So I tried a couple of different doublings. First, I tried Barry saxophone, but we're out of range. I tried the classic MS Barry saxophone sound because that doesn't follow the range parameters of the actual instrument. It wasn't quite what I wanted. I ended up using here, just again, old school, using synthesizers to support various things. I ended up using a bass. It's a synthesizer bass, but it's actually a saw wave synthesized bass. And here's the bass trombone note. And here's the synthesizer. Totally different sound, but you can hear that very high frequency edge on it. Even though it's a very low note, you can hear that rasp going on. And if we put this together, this is the bass trombone with these hits. And again, I shortened the notes. And on these, because there's not a good tail on the release, what I did is I put fortissimo on every one of the hits I was using with a decrescendo hairpin dynamic on there so that it tapers off for each one. And it's a lot of detail, but it's worth the payoff. So you can hear the early part of the note, you get that rasp, it kind of tapers out. And if we put this with the tuba, you'll really understand what the outcome is. Now, again, you can hear a little bit. You can hear a little bit of what it is when I point it out. But in context, it's a different story. If we go up here, close out my mixer, and I select my the whole brass section. So we have horns, horn parts up here. We have the trumpet with the added layer for this brassy, edgy cree-ray is what we call it, sound. Same for the trombones. And then the bass trombone added sound down here, and then the tuba. Listen carefully. Now, in addition to that, if we listen to the entire ensemble now, we can get the entire picture. Very nice added details there that will really shine out when we go through the mastering process later on. Now, just for comparison, this is the final mastered track, and you can hear how when you put some of that, push that high end, some of the low, you put a little bit of a mid scoop in there to get the mud out of the original M4 playback. This is what you end up with all those details added in. And there you have it. So layering in additional samples and synthesizers to support various elements inside of your score. And this is you have to be picky and choosy about it. You want to identify those moments that need just something a little bit of extra. Go find the extra, bring it into the project, into the score, and then only apply it where it's absolutely necessary to add those details. And I would argue this really doesn't matter what libraries you're using. I don't think the answer is necessarily always going to be to get the next better library or to replace certain instruments from one library with instruments from another. That can help, that can get you a long way. But in the end, the more detail that you add using various layers from any kind of source that will accomplish your goal, that is probably the best way to go about getting to your end, whatever you define that to be. So don't be afraid to use things in unorthodox ways. Again, this is a normal practice in digital audio workstation mockup, orchestral mockup. And that's what we're doing here. We're just doing mockups, but we're doing it inside of this environment rather than a MIDI environment, really using a lot of the same tools in terms of sample libraries now. But we're bringing in the techniques. We're bringing those techniques into play here. And this will always be superior, I think, to any play engine and configuration of sampled sounds that any company will ever come up with for their play from notation platform. It will always be better to go outside the box, add layers in, create that playback file, modify various elements like length, articulation, and whatnot in order to get what it is that you want. One quick thing just to keep in mind when it comes to notation versus MIDI mockup. When you think about notation versus MIDI mockup, inside of the digital audio workstation with MIDI mockup, you have to keep in mind there's no such thing as dynamics and articulation. There are libraries that have various dynamics and articulation velocity layers and crossfading capability, but those things are all arbitrary and relative. They're not well defined. They're not easily defined. What you do is you create the music to sound realistic using whatever MIDI controller settings that will get you to that end. When that music, if it needs to be turned into notation, let's say for a film score, and it needs to be read by a studio orchestra, what happens is there's an interpretation that goes on from the MIDI mockup where you interpret what is there into how it probably would be written as notation to get professional players to emulate that exact same outcome. So keep that in mind. When we're looking at notation and going in the other direction, what we really want to do is take our notation that is, appropriate to read, and we want to pick it apart, dissect it, break it down, and even, kind of destroy it in a way so that we get the playback that a real person would do if they were confronted with that notation. And this also plays into how people play on instruments too. You have to know how instruments work, what the kind of outcome is when a particular instrument plays a certain kind of passage. That comes with experience with instruments, of course. So I invite you to, listen to real orchestras, listen to chamber groups and small ensembles, and follow along with the score. If you are not schooled in this, I'm an instrumental music teacher, so I have an intimate knowledge of instrumentation because I teach it. And I, of course, went to school to learn that and have had a lot of experience with instruments. And if that's not your case, what I recommend is, take a look at solo and small ensemble works of various styles, various genres, and listen to that music with score in hand if possible, and just take note of how the instruments respond in certain situations. Really, if you just did this with a couple of really solid pieces, just pick a solid woodwind quintet piece, a solid brass quintet piece, a really good string chamber piece, and listen to those with score in hand, and just take note of just a handful of idiosyncrasies that you notice with those instruments, and then try to apply that to your mock-up. That will get you a very, very long way. That's my recommendation. So, best of luck with this, and happy composing.